Hi, I'm Steve Hassan, and I am delighted to have with me on this interview a friend and colleague from Scotland, psychiatrist Nick Child. Nick, thank you so much for agreeing to do this with me.
Thank you for having me. It's great.
And just for our listeners and our regulars, I would say that I was invited to come to Scotland to do a presentation on the dark side of hypnosis for the British Society of Hypnosis, and that's where we met and we bonded immediately, and we had a good friendship. And we're also on the board of the Open Minds Foundation.
Right.
And Nick, I'm going to let you share, your interests and such that I've asked you to do this blog about parental alienation, please.
Okay. Well, I think I should, I must, because it's my thing, take a slightly broader view.
Please.
You're talking about cults, and there's lots of other places where we find totalist influence, undue influence. And Amy J. Baker was the person who put me right, because I dismissed parental alienation until a client came and taught me about it by sending me Amy J. Baker's book on adult children of parental alienation syndrome.
And I should just interrupt you and say Amy J. Baker is a developmental psychologist in New York City, and she's written a number of very important books on the subject.
She's a leading researcher and voice in the field.
And in her original book, actually, she cited my bite model. I might stick in that mention.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the paper before that book was published in Cult Studies Review, I think it's called. The point is, the thing that hit me in the stomach about the book was the likening of parental alienation to cults and to the influence of cults. And I thought, jings, to put it mildly. So I then, that was about 10 years ago. And so since then, along with that client, I've been learning fast. And I also, I've stopped working directly with clients. I do indirect work. And I just think I can do more by reading and researching and thinking and writing blogs and so on. And the thing I want to say is that what struck me is there's so many specialist forms of undue influence, parental alienation being one of them, cults being another. And I thought, well, surely it's wise to try and bring it together, hence the interest in Open Minds Foundation. And I would want to say that if you call in undue influence coercive control, which is a name that was invented, created, discovered by the feminist ideology looking at domestic violence, and it's a very important concept, and of course it works there. And so I would want to say, if you're talking about family undue influence, first of all, family undue influence exists in and around cults, which is why you'll find it in families in cults, and you'll find it in families where a loved one is in a cult that you've written so much about.
Yeah.
And then secondly, you find it in the coercive control that's been described so clearly for domestic abuse of intimate partners.
Right.
But it's the same, the core of it, I would say, is the same for all of these, and including parental alienation, which is, to come to the topic, when one parent turns one of their children or more of their children against the other parent without good reason in a lasting way. And so that sounds simple. I call all of these relationships that take you in and cut you off. And I would expand on what that means, but basically it's like being fooled into thinking that the person who's closest to you and attached to you is the one who knows best, and you'd better cling on to them, and you had better exclude those people I decide are not good for you, and that's the other parent in the case of parental alienation. In the case of domestic intimate partner violence, it's the rest of the world. I know best, and you'd better put up with me, and they won't love you anyway, they won't believe you. All these kinds of things, to me, you just read your books, and it's the same thing. However, I know there's big differences, but that's my thing, is I want to kind of say, look, guys, let's all team up together rather than fight each other.
Right.
In particular, the gendered view of domestic abuse in couples and the gendered view of parental alienation, neither of these are completely true. There are plenty of mothers who are alienated. It's usually seen as dads, and it is because of the way things work in our society.
Yes.
And there are a significant number of men who are abused by their partners. So.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So
if I could just jump in and say your original definition about alienating the children against the other parent for no good reason, I wanted to just chime in and say, like, for example, one case that I actually read about a story of a woman now who had been alienated as a child. What her story was that her mother had had an affair. Father found out and threw the mother out and wanted to punish the mother by keeping the children from the mother.
Yeah.
So for him, he had a very justified reason, you know, because she had the audacity to cheat on him.
Yes.
And so he wanted to punish her.
So let me just say a bit more. I mean, you're leaping ahead into.
I apologize, Nick. Go ahead.
No, I don't apologize. It's great. So when we talk about justified reasons, it's complicated because parental alienation is itself emotional abuse. So whatever it is, abuse is happening. But parental alienation often entails false allegations. So in that case, there may well have been an actual affair that this father used to carry his feelings and his designs into. But in the severe cases of parental alienation, there is either intentional or unintentional profound belief that something terrible, or profound allegation that something terrible has happened with the other parent. And that's used in family courts in particular that don't really often know how to deal with this kind of stuff. They see it, but they just don't know what to do because they have to do what's required. They have to bring in an assessment of the allegation. It takes 9 months. And by the time the 9 months is over, no contact has happened with the other parent. And by that time, the child is completely convinced, as if in a cult.
Mm-hmm.
But I would like to jump in on your theme because, of course, let me just come at it this way. Alexander Stein wrote a book recently about applying attachment theory, well, one of many versions of attachment theory,
Yes.
to how to explain cults and how the leaders of cults recruit and retain their members. And she talks of what is there in it for the leader?
Mm.
What is there in it for the coercive controller? And I think it's really important to realize that many coercive controllers are not evil.
Mm-hmm.
They feel justified. They feel that they know best. And she says, well, what's in it for them is an attachment that is very, very secure. So if you look to those who are coercive and controlling, the theory would be, and the finding hopefully would be, that you will find that these extremely helpful coercive people have had some kind of trauma in their background, mm-hmm. where they are so desperately fearful of losing an attachment that they go to these coercive lengths to keep somebody close. And you will find, of course, a lot of people use terms for that sort of personality, narcissistic, sociopathic, variety of terms. But I am more interested in understanding all parties in this terrible nightmare of a family pattern and a cult pattern.
Right. Great. So, and of course, from my work with Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, Moonies, Scientologists, they all organizationally insist that if one of the parents have left the fold, you know, the true believer status, then they're demonized. They're possessed by the devil. They've been taken over by Satan. they're in their reactive mind, etc. And so I've always known about this phenomenon from the cult realm, but it was my interactions with Amy Baker where she was explaining, and then you opened my eyes even wider to just the millions and millions and millions of people around the world who, without a cult context, but this dysfunctional family system thing, was doing this type of coercive control.
Sometimes you can see the extended family as being a bit like an informal cult, let's call it, strongly influential over the adult child who is the parent of the child. I was going to say something about the shunning. Julia Goodcassel, who you know is a colleague here in Scotland, has done some research on Jehovah's Witnesses, and we were just having a discussion recently by email about shunning. Out of that came the idea that if you've been recruited to Jehovah's Witnesses or a cult and then get chucked out and shunned, it's like a double whammy of being cut off from your loved ones. And it's interesting in her research, what she said was, in the people she interviewed in depth, they were all very upset, as one always is by shunning of all kinds. This was the most appalling experience. But in the long run, they said it was the best thing that happened to them. So if you like...
Well, it was the best thing that happened to them in the sense that it forced them to interact with the outside world and like find out what's normal and healthy.
The shunning reversed the original cutting off. Does that make sense? So these are more interesting, complex considerations, but certainly parental alienation is found. You talk to anybody who's in cults, and immediately you can start talking about families. The cult takes precedence because, of course, it's the sort of strikingly weird way of living. But as soon as you get into it, you discover there's families and individuals cut off from families and people cut out from their families outside of the cult and so on.
Right. I'm going to take the liberty of sharing my influence continuum for a moment, which is on my website. And just add that in dysfunctional family systems, it's really about conformity and dependency and obedience to the authority figure.
Yes.
But on the healthy side, healthy parenting is about recognizing the uniqueness of each child and realizing your job as a parent is to love your children unconditionally and to help them become their best selves. And that the goal is for them to become individuated as a person, so that they think for themselves and have their own feelings, and it can differ from what you think they should be doing with their life or what they should be believing with their life. But there's a recognition that different people have different things. Can you share your thoughts?
It's really important. I use that influence continuum a lot because, of course, coercion itself, coercive control even, is not in itself bad. Especially if you've got children, parents and teachers spend a lot of their time trying to coercively control the children to do things that they think are good for them. What you've said, of course, is right. It's done within an ethical, loving basis with a whole lot of the other things that you've described. But you need to look at the wider context and ask the question of, when you pull a child away from being run over by a bus, that's pretty coercive. But if it's saving the child's life, then you have to say, well, this is somebody who cares. So I agree that you've got to look at that. The thing is, we can all agree with that. But when you're really upset as a parent after splitting up from your partner, and when that triggers often there's been, good reason to feel really upset and angry, or you feel it's good reason, it's very difficult to remember what you've just listed as good parenting.
Right, to put the child's needs over your needs.
That's very difficult because you have to, and of course many parents realize this and can manage their own upset and hurt without turning the child against the other parent. So they've fallen out with their ex-partner. They know that the child still loves that ex-partner. That's the other half of their genes and their personality. And so they know that they've got to really actively support that child's relationship. It's just so easy, though, when you're really upset and angry and feel you know best, and when you're worried that you're going to lose your child to them, you are going to unintentionally or intentionally find yourself unable to do the left-hand side of your diagram.
Right. Right. No, exactly. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard people describing their relationship with their child like they're their best friend.
Oh, yeah.
And so they talk to their 11-year-old daughter like an adult and get into all kinds of adult dynamics and discussions of things that have happened that were upsetting. That's completely inappropriate from any professional psychological evaluation. And it's, yeah, go ahead, please.
So some people call that inverting the hierarchy, that children can't cope with that kind of position of being the parent's partner. And I was just thinking, as you described it, that's probably not something you see in cults, where the subordinates are made to, well, I suppose they're made to feel superior to the rest of the world. But I suspect in a cult you wouldn't get quite that kind of promotion of you're my best pal.
No, because in a cult, you're afraid to tell your real feelings to anybody because it's going to get reported in and you're going to get into trouble for that. So it's in a destructive cult, there's much more of a sense of a dual identity is how I describe it.
So let me chip in there, because that's another thing that I want to discuss further with people who know better. I have this simple distinction between people who are being controlled but kind of know that they're controlled. They're fearful, they are miserable, and I think of that as people who are trapped, but they've still got their authentic self on board with which to feel fearful and upset and trapped.
Yes.
To me, in the typical cult description, where you've got a cult identity and the authentic identity is put on a shelf or further in the back of the cupboard, that is quite like, to me, that's why Amy J. Baker was right to make the parallel, because with extreme parental alienation, you have the same loss of an authentic identity. You have this crazy, melodramatic, virtually, presentation that no child who's really been abused would present. So you do have this false identity, complete loyalty, black and white, 100% loyalty to the resident parent usually, and complete hatred and rejection of the non-resident parent for no, even the reasons given are like, he slams doors, or she made me eat my beans. So what I'm saying is parental alienation. Now, I would say it doesn't look as bad because the child or the cult member is, as you've described it yourself, when you're in the Moonies, what do you mean there's no problem here? I'm as happy as I could ever possibly be. And so the child in the parental alienation situation would do the same. Whereas in, say, coercive control domestic violence, of course there's entrapment, but I suspect that the person has, many victims of domestic abuse have still got their authentic identity in place. They therefore are much more miserable. But in a way, I would say, and ask you, would you say if you've got even a shred of your authentic identity left, you're a step further forward than when you've lost all your authentic identity?
Oh, absolutely. And yeah, so we could go in different directions talking psychologically. I guess I'm really wanting to pick your brain, Nick, on what either parents can do if they find themselves cut off from their children are under 18, but then if they're over 18, but their children still won't have anything to do with them, or even their side of the family, grandma, grandpa, aunt, uncles and stuff. I'd love to tap your wisdom and advice, please.
Well, what a big question. That's the whole story, isn't it? I think let's take the under 18 because that's where it mostly presents.
But it presents in courts under 18.
Well, that's where it suddenly hits home, that you suddenly feel you're drowning in a river, and you can't get out, and it seems to get worse. So the first thing is, when it's extreme, it's very difficult to see how you can do anything without the family courts.
Mm-hmm.
But there are a number of people who would say there must be, of course, everyone says if you can possibly go to mediation or some collaborative means of help, but we're talking about people who just cannot bring themselves to do that. It's just not on. So you kind of need a formula with the extreme situation where authority is held by something like a court to make an order that you've got to do something collaborative, since you don't know how to do it yourself, for the sake of the child. And it's not both parents. It's usually, in parental alienation, one parent is the one who's in charge of it, and the other parent is, in a sense, just having to follow along. They're not usually the resident parent, and what lawyers will tell you is possession is 9/10 of the law, and that certainly works with children. So you've got the family law, and there are those who are working very hard to do the right thing, to pull drowning bodies out way downriver. But I am really keen, because few other people are, I'm really keen to get people stopped from being pushed in the river, and preferably rescued out of the river as soon as they fall in. And I have some ideas that are far too undeveloped yet. Well, they're quite developed, but they're not ready for publication. Me and my colleague, we've got some ideas about that. At the moment, I'm just creating a context in which people can begin to say maybe family law needs to be reviewed, like it hasn't been since 40 years ago when it drifted into this job. The good news, though, is that at least there is family law, where with cults, as you working hard, I know, how can you create, for adults particularly in cults, how can you create a crime that can be pursued?
Right.
With families, at least you do have the sense of it's already there's something going on. It's not a crime, but it's a civil court. So you do have some power. What to do? Well, the first thing is, you've suddenly fallen in the river and you never knew what this was about. So you need to very quickly do a lot of learning.
Right.
And so one of the places you can do that is on the resources page of my website, and there's 1,000 other websites. The problem there is you won't know which one is best. There's lots of different kinds of ways in which people advise. There are those who've just got their own experience to go by, and they're full of hate, and they say it's always men or it's always this. And of course,
well, now you're talking about evaluating your resource person of who you're relying on for advice.
That's it.
I like your website. I feel like you have no vested interest other than that you're a caregiver. You have a lifetime of service to people.
Yeah.
You retired. You realized there's this huge social problem, and you just want people to have the best life they can have and to experience the positives of both parents. No parent is perfect, by the way. So but the issue is really, social good. That's why one reason I asked you to do this interview with me. So
there will be people who have a different view to mine about what's best, but I really am always ready to be have a discussion with people who disagree. And so I agree with you. That's what I aspire to be. And I'm never saying I really know the ultimate truth in any of this. And so the blog is the Alienation Experience, one word, the alienationexperience.org.uk.
Yeah, we'll put it in this video link as well as in the blog.
So, and it has it's a huge page. Sorry about that, but it's got a lot of caveats: how you choose people, how you think for yourself. And then there's a list of kind of top short introductions, and then it just gets bigger. And then there's videos, top video, short videos, and then go down the page. There's more and more.
No, I love it. That's why I wanted to reach across the seas to tap.
And then just to add, of course, the more attractive stuff, which is on the home page. There's a nice array of visuals and titles, which once you've done some basic learning about it, you might enjoy going into some of those. And I specialize in unusual viewpoints. So just one that comes to mind is it's a very serious problem. There's lots of very serious ways of looking at it. And I've suggested, though, that you should be like Statler and Waldorf in the Muppet Show, theater critics, because in my view, parental alienation is like a huge melodrama with a very poor script and histrionic acting. And if you think like that, it may help you see as a professional or as a sufferer. So I'm just saying I have a number of ways in which I try and say, look, if you look at it this way, it might be helpful. Another simple one I have is I like teaming up together the term abduction, child abduction, with parental alienation, because that switches on the right part of your brain. Everyone knows child abduction is bad. So I say let's call the whole thing, because extreme parental alienation achieves the same outcome. And let's call it parental child abduction and alienation.
I like that very much, actually.
Do you know the video Victims of Another War? Perhaps you don't. It was done by people who are now more specializing in child abduction. But it was originally about abduction and alienation, because if you abduct your child, this is parental abduction, of course.
Right.
Abductions, parental child abduction. You then have to persuade your child that there was a good reason to take them across the Atlantic.
Right.
And so you have to alienate them. Your mother hated you. She's dead. She never loved you. So
she was an alcoholic.
So you have to do the alienation after you've got them away.
Right.
But I like the juxtaposition, because it immediately says to people, this is something that is urgent and you need to do something about.
Right. And there's a tendency, unfortunately, with people who have not had exposure to this field to blame the victim. Well, if your child doesn't want to talk to you, you must have done something wrong.
Yeah.
Instead of an assumption of innocence, there's an assumption of wrongdoing.
Well, if you know anything about family courts, you'll know the phrase, there's no smoke without fire. So, I could just, you must know more than I do with the thousands of hypnotic techniques, but, I could just say, Fred, that guy, you know it. Just watch it. You hardly have to say anything. You just kind of do that nod, and that Fred has done something really bad. Right? And that gossip spreads, and people just are ready to believe these kinds of hints. And so no smoke without fire means even if it's just an allegation, something must have happened. Now,
and then the person overreacts.
Yeah,
I didn't do that. And the more they get angry and upset,
you must have. And the trouble is,
it's just doing the opposite of what you want to do in terms of promoting a view that you're calm and cool and caring.
So you see, the family courts start from the assumption that no parent has actually done anything wrong, but they're still highly adversarial. And in fact, these allegations, which haven't been dealt with in the proper way, if they were made properly outside of a family court through reporting to the authorities, police, social work, I'm not saying they're always brilliant at dealing with it, but they are the people who should be. So in it comes to the family courts, and everybody's trying to be sensible and talk, but you've meantime got the smoke clouding the whole scene up.
Right.
And nobody tackles it. Nobody
Right.
tackles it. No, well, a good legislation will tackle it early, because you kind of need to deal with it. Otherwise, everybody is thinking, well, there's fire going on here, and we can't talk about arrangements and contact if there's something terrible happening.
Yeah, and waiting 9 months or 2 years to establish contact is too long. We could talk for hours, but I want to just switch gears, if I can, to get your wisdom and what you would say to, let's say, a 21-year-old who hasn't spent any time with his mother for 10 years because of a parental alienation situation. He's now graduating college, but there's been no contact. Do you have any thoughts of what message you'd like to convey?
I have lots of thoughts. You're describing it, it's a slightly unusual situation. It could happen that, and it often happens out of the blue, that somebody who's been alienated, because remember, they've been, in the extreme case, they've been totally convinced that their mom, let's say the parent they lived with for 10 years is wonderful, and that bastard over there isn't. So it can take more than a few years, and Amy J. Baker's book describes people looking back decades sometimes before they can think for themselves, in your terms, cult terms, how did they get that, so that it can be, and then, even then, it can be really hard, because now you're doing something, you're going to be out of this house. If you say, I've just contacted my dad, your mum may say, if you contact him, you're out. Shunning.
Right, or you're cut out of the will.
That's it. So you're not going to find it easy to just suddenly say, I'm going to contact my dad.
Right.
The dad, or the mother, the alienated parent, needs to do the most difficult thing in the world, having survived this appalling nightmare of losing their child who they've loved and were safe with, and the child was safe with. They have to keep going as if their child was still in their life, so that when the child does contact them, the parent is not in a mess.
Right.
Now, what I would say to people, this is not the only advice, but it's the one that I like. There's a guy called Ryan Thomas, and he's got a blog called Ryan Thomas Speaks, and he's got the gift of the gab. And he is a reunited, alienated, he calls it, an alienated child. He's American, or North American. And he's got loads of wonderful videos. He makes some money out of it, but why not? But a lot of it is for free. And he does kind of a free webinar, and he describes, for example, how to write a text message as a parent to your alienated child. It's very like your advice to people rescuing somebody they love from a cult.
I'm not familiar with this. I have to check this. Ryan Thomas Speaks.
That's the name of his website, .com, I guess.
Uh-huh.
And but it's a bit like your advice. You have to build rapport, because if you go straight for the jugular, you're out.
Right.
So he goes through this text message, the one that looks like it's a loving, good one to send, and he says, no, in these following 20 ways, it's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a better way to write it. And so I'd advise people, I just think he's the most entertaining and accessible resource for somebody who, he's actually talking to the alienated parent, but I think an alienated 21-year-old might also get a heck of a lot from watching his material.
Well, and I think I would love to, if anyone's watching this who was alienated from their parent and has realized that it was not right, it's not healthy parenting, that your parent who told you all the terrible things did you wrong, I would love to mobilize you to share your experiences and to network with others who had that same experience, because I think that messaging needs to go out on the internet loud and clear.
I would echo that. The thing is, when you've been through such a nightmare, like many people who've been in and come out of cults, you really want to get on with your life in a healthy way and persist, doing what we do, which is kind of make a study of it and campaign about it, is probably a bit unhealthy.
Yeah.
It occurs to me there's a lot of people thinking about how do you help children at a young age be undue influence proof, not just against cults and gangs and all kinds of
Right.
So again, Amy Baker and a colleague tried to run some school programs, and I think they've gone and they're into a different. So I'm just saying there are other ways in which people are trying to think how to get children to think, is this right?
So Amy, the last time I talked with her, it's been a while, but she developed a middle school program for guidance counselors who are aware that a child that there is in their school, their parents are divorcing, and it's a prescribed course to teach children like what's normal, what's healthy, and what parents are allowed to do and what kind of is not okay for them to do. Like one parent can't tell a child they can't have good feelings towards the other parent. Just as one example, which I thought was a wonderful idea, but how to get it in all of the school systems around the world is the question.
Just one more thought occurs to me on this line. If you read Richard Vorshak's book, Divorce Poison, his second edition has a wonderful appendix or introduction with a wonderful story from an adult woman psychotherapist. And she describes how she wishes at the age of 18, when her dad did say something very gentle like, "Are you sure your mom's views about me, haven't influenced?" He just said something very gentle, and she immediately was triggered into thinking afresh.
Yeah.
I wish he had done that years before. Now, that's the reverse advice: to build rapport, don't try and challenge, and all that. But it's quite a lovely story because it does make you think, well, hang on a sec, maybe the alienated parent could be more challenging to their child. And the guy in the story, clearly thought really carefully what he's going to say. But there she is. She says, I would have been helped out of my dream, I think she calls it.
Right.
We've done that earlier.
But would you agree with me, Nick, that even a horrible, abusive parent that did alienate, that the child, that now adult child perhaps, still may have feelings of love towards that person, and it would be wrong to tell them that you shouldn't love your father because of what he did to you and what he did to your mother?
So hang on, have I got you right there? You're saying somebody did do something abusive, or...
Right. In other words, I've encountered people so many times where they still love the abusive parent.
Oh, yes.
And once they're connected with the estranged parent and bonded, there's a tendency to want to be angry at the abuser parent previously, and it gets into a similar type of reverse alienation or something. And
yeah. This may not answer your point, but and it's a complicated point, because children who are abused, whether emotionally or sexually or physically, they still have an attachment to their abusive parent.
Right.
Of course, they may be terrified and not want to see them, but there's an attachment because that's their only parent.
Right.
I think what the dominant culture believes that what's good for children who've been abused of all kinds is if the abusive parent is evaporated the next morning, executed at dawn, got rid of. And nobody ever thinks, hang on a sec, there's something more, there's other needs that this child has with their abusive parent. Obviously, it's not necessarily contact, but it's some kind of therapeutic work. And maybe some kind of therapeutic work will lead to some kind of ongoing relationship that's healthy and has repaired something. So I don't know if that answers your point, but I wish that people weren't as vicious as wanting to just get rid of this terrible abusive person. And just to add, there's a debate goes on in the field of parental alienation, which is that the alienating parent is so evil, is so unable to change, so terrible in their personality, which may all be true, that the child should be immediately, well, as soon as can be arranged and carefully done, the child should be rehabilitated with the alienated parent and never see the alienating parent. Now, I say to you, there may well be, I'm sure there are situations where the start of returning of health to that child is to be placed with their healthier parent.
Mm-hmm.
And that people say for 9 months or 3 months or something, they shouldn't see the other parent because it's too difficult. It's a bit like going back into a cult. You can't leave a cult and then keep visiting every week. Right?
Right.
But I think in the long run, it seems a bit odd to me that people aren't looking more carefully at the possibility that this child, solving this child's original problem, which was being cut off from one parent, doesn't seem to me terribly well solved by cutting them off from the other parent.
Right. So I think we're in agreement. And of course, I'm for, and I think you are too, education, like teaching children like what's healthy parenting and what's not healthy parenting, and giving those guidelines and encouraging the child to think over their own experience, as well as orienting the child if dad says something against mom, to how to react to that. For example, the healthy thing, dad, is for you not to say anything bad about mom, and the healthy thing is for mom not to say anything bad about you. So please don't. And I'm going to hold mom to the same standard. Again, depending on the child, how old, how mature, but giving, in other words, proactive suggestions, real tools and strategies is very helpful, I think.
I agree with you, but people will say, but there are some parents who just cannot do that. They cannot learn and won't. It's a bit like, imagine trying to teach Ron Hubbard a few of those tricks. He doesn't need to, he won't. He'll never sit down and listen.
And that's why every case needs to be evaluated on its own. But I will tell you, because I've been now in the mental health field for 40 odd years, that I was taught that personality disorders, especially narcissistic personality disorder, it's a lifetime sentence. Like, you can't fix it. But in the last 6-7 years, through one of my teachers, Daniel Brown, he's developed a model of internal reparenting, where if the narcissistic disordered personality person commits to the therapy and does this diligently, they actually can change their personality attachment structure and develop a sense of social perspective taking and empathy, which is the key. If they're missing the ability to step into their child's shoes or step into their ex's shoes, then of course they're going to make all decisions based on what makes them feel better.
It's very exciting work, isn't it? I love to hear about that, because it does link back to the power of attachment science, I now call it, attachment science, which I think helps all of this understanding about relationships that take you in and cut you off.
Right.
I would just add another point about children. The reason why we should all team together under the banner of undue influence or relationships that take you in and cut you off is because there's not a lot of space in a school curriculum for teaching kids.
Right.
And so you need to meld together all the same messages that apply to learning how to protect yourself from cult recruitment, to learning how to spot when a parent is, let's say, not getting it right. So I would like to find people, well, there are people who are looking at how would you teach this,
Right.
so that you don't have to have hours and hours, one about parental alienation, another about domestic abuse and child abuse, another about cults, another about drugs, another about trafficking. You know, I think somewhere in there's a core method, and I would bring in the Ira Chalaf book.
I love Ira's work.
Intelligent Disobedience.
Right, and courageous followership, and the blink, think, choice, voice model for children. I love that as well.
Yeah.
So I have one more area I want to tap your brain with. I know we're running out of time, but thank you for, I know it's nighttime there now. I'd like to tap what you would say to therapists who are currently advising clients, almost like a dogma, that if you're in from a toxic family, cut off. Like your brother's toxic, have nothing to do with him. Just like carte blanche, just cut off. What would you say to such therapists?
Therapists who are advising their clients to just deal with toxic relationships by cutting off.
Yeah. There are actually such people who may have cut off from their own family, and they're using their own choices and transferring it onto their clients, and the clients are, buying into it.
For therapists to be that dogmatic about anything is worrying. But on the other hand, therapists have one of these extraordinary responsibilities to learn about so many things, to be competent with a wide range of clients.
Mm-hmm.
And so continuing professional learning is lifelong. I think no therapy really, if you feel that dogmatic about anything, it should be somebody else should be involved in the case, either some other therapist, or you should be saying to a colleague or to a manager or supervisor, you should be saying, I'm worried about this case. Can you help me think this through? It's got me really going. I think this client's in danger of damage or being murdered. Can we talk it through? So I think the trigger is, as soon as you're that dogmatic, you should talk to somebody about it, if you're a therapist or if you're anybody.
Right, and I would add that if you are in therapy with someone, especially if you've been seeing them for years and you've been following their advice for years, not to see your family, not to go home for holidays, not to send birthday cards and holiday cards and such, get a second or third opinion.
Yeah.
Because I've worked with people who've had an undue relationship where the therapist was the controller, where they weren't putting what's best for the clients ahead of their own,
You may be, I don't recognize, but I'm not that experienced with a wide range of therapists, but I don't recognize that as a picture in Britain. I think we may have therapists who are, in a sense, they are the other direction. They aren't strong enough in their understanding of some of these undue influence situations, because you do need to be, with parental alienation, certainly, you need to be really pretty dogmatic and clear that you know what you're doing. But in this case, not to cut them off from relationships, but to push them towards the relationship they're cut off from. So the therapists who work with parental alienation with the authority of the court will argue quite rightly and strongly that they need quite a bit of strong personality, and they can get into trouble because of that. So I would say that's a reverse picture, where a therapist is being strong in an ethical cause. On the whole, we're about to teach some counselors 5 of us have got a little mini conference, I call it, coming up. And so you're asking a question which is interesting us as well, as to what can you say to the ordinary, let's say ordinary counselor? How will they spot somebody? What do they do about it? And of course, if somebody comes in the room and says, I'm trying to get out of a cult and I'm having trouble, then you've got an explicit request, which is not...
Which almost never happens.
Never happens. So you've got to do
almost never. Sometimes people see something about a cult story and they go, that's my story. And it turns on a light bulb. But anyway, go on.
But I would say over the last few decades, all helping professionals have had to learn about stuff they were blind to before, like baby bashing was news, like domestic abuse was news. And as long as a therapist doesn't think about it, doesn't know about it, they're not going to be able to be told about it. Child sexual abuse in an adult, of course.
Right.
That's news. I mean, I'm talking about 40 years.
Right. 40, 50 years ago, it wasn't on in people.
So if a therapist doesn't know about child sexual abuse, they're just going to not be in any fit state to listen to it or ask questions around it, you know.
Right.
So I would say we're about to teach some counselors the next thing that they need to learn about, and it's all undue influence.
Right. So I guess I want to tell a quick story, bring it back to cults for a minute and wrap up with you. True story about a family whose loved one got into Scientology, you know, and tried to encourage the person to talk to ex-members and read John Atek's book, A Piece of Blue Sky, etc. And the person cut off contact, but still wanted to borrow money from them to take more courses, and in many cases did. Years went on, the person didn't come home for weddings, birthdays, holidays, maybe came home and stole some jewelry, if I'm remembering correctly, to pay for their debt in Scientology. Then I think the mother passed away, and before she died in the hospital, asked for the Scientologist to come and visit. That didn't happen. Then a few more years elapsed and the person left Scientology and wanted to reconnect with the family and felt terrible about how they had behaved. And the family wanted nothing to do with them.
Yeah.
Said, you turned your back on mom, you stole from us, you're not part of this family anymore. You're dead to us. And this person, this ex-Scientologist, came to me and asked me, could I help?
Yeah.
And of course, I understood why the Scientologist did those things. And so I volunteered to reach out to the person, most likely, I think it was a sibling, to take my call at least. And in that case, there was a happy ending, but it was a lot of grief work, a lot of anger, and all of that. But what I'm trying to convey is the role of a mediator type person who can be a bridge person back to the alienated family or parents to begin the baby steps of realizing, you know, we can live in the past and the trauma of the past, or we can be in the here and now and think about what we would like for the future and what we might benefit from in terms of going forward.
Yeah.
Any comments or?
Well, not really. I just think you're describing a vision of how difficult and complex the work is at a later stage, the damage that's done, the relationships that were available and then were killed off, as it were, temporarily at least, by the cult's control of the person in their care and harm. And my thought is that you're describing the role of a particular kind of yet to be named therapist, because you've got to be, again, so knowledgeable and skillful and so strong as a personality yourself, with a whole range of tools in your toolbox. And that sort of therapist is going to take some growing. At the moment, we're still generally trying to get ordinary therapists and counselors to think about undue influence, so that when they see somebody coming in, they remember to ask, what are your hobbies? What groups are you involved in? What's that like? Is it comfortable? What's the priest like? We're just at a really baby step stage of developing a therapeutic profession of the kind you've just described.
Yeah, well, it's we have a lot more work to do out there. I want to thank you for who you are. I also want to put a plug in for your TEDx talk on being a maverick. I think it's a must-see for everybody, because I think everyone should think out of the box. I think it's a great theme, and you're a special person, Nick. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve.
And I'll say goodbye at this moment, and we'll do a blog, and hopefully it will help a lot of people. So thank you, Nick.